I am now recording with McCall Jones. McCall, how have you been? It's been a little while.
It's been a while. It's been uh,
Yeah.
it's been fun. It's been
Hmm.
interesting. And I think the world has changed significantly since we last spoke, and it was only a matter of months ago. So we'll
Yeah,
see
yeah,
what we
yeah.
got.
And I'm glad that we finally got the opportunity to do this because to be honest, I was a little busy and a little disenfranchised from all the politics last year, especially. So
Yeah,
I
no pun
I
intended, right?
became a little bit like what's the word? You know, I isolated, like probably like I was pre-pandemic from politics for the
Hmm.
last, I don't know, year, give or take.
Hmm.
But I know it's sort of a one of your passions. One of the things that you're really into is politics and such things. So um yeah, what's going on with you and what's going on in the world, and yeah, let's just try to catch up on things.
Yeah. Um, I
We'll start with what's going on with you in the past year.
So
How's
going
that?
with me in the past year. I have spent, the past year really recovering from
Mm.
the devastation of the shutdowns.
Right, right, right.
I got sick for about 3 weeks in the early part of the year,
Mm.
but it was relatively mild,
Mm-hmm.
and I came back very quickly. So I was very thankful that I didn't have anything, severe to worry about.
Right.
But beyond that, I think the biggest challenge has been in the financial and business realms.
Right. Yeah, especially
I
with all
was
the inflation this year.
I was going to get to that as
Yeah.
part of the process. In other
Right,
words, we
right.
go into it and prices are extremely low because demand had fallen through the floor. I mean,
Right.
basically, gasoline, for example, had gotten down to, under $1 in some parts of the country,
Right. And
when
flights even.
and even flights had gone down to 20 and
Right.
$30. So that became
Right.
a pretty regular thing, but by and large, we weren't allowed to travel. And
Yeah.
then when things did come back, we saw any number of economic reasons for inflation, not only demand,
Right,
but the
right.
circumstances that were set up that ultimately led to, and were, I'll even throw in the important word that these changes, these policies, very predictably produced substantial inflation
Hmm.
that we're now dealing with. And
Right.
my frustration is, we have a generation of people that have been deliberately isolated from learning and understanding how economics works.
Hmm.
They've been taught to vilify, the system, but they haven't
Right.
really been taught how the system actually runs.
Right.
And when things like inflation, like employment, uh, you know, are changed from a policy perspective, and the things that occur when those policies change actually happen,
Mm-hmm.
they're completely ignorant of why they've happened, and they'll literally believe exactly what they're told.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me has been, I think, a pretty unique frustration. But that said,
Mm-hmm.
um, progress has been slow and steady, but I've
Yeah.
been making the comeback. It's been
Right.
a function of discipline. It's been a
Right.
function of maintaining one's health and fitness. I think has been not just a function of vanity, but I
And
do think
mental
it's a
health.
function, and mental health is
Right.
included in that.
Right.
And I think pre-pandemic, this
Mm.
concept of staying fit was more about vanity and acceptance and
Mm.
social leverage. But I
Right, right,
really
right.
find that staying fit is an absolute necessity for both
Right.
physical and mental health.
Right, right, right.
So I think that's an important thing that people have finally realized.
Right.
A lot of things are coming out that were punishable a year ago, in terms of information that I think is changing the landscape.
And it was
But
punishable to go to the gym not long, not
and
much
it was
longer than a
indeed,
year ago.
I mean, I remember,
Yeah.
watching people be arrested
Mm.
being by themselves on the beach,
Right, right, right. Yeah.
when all this first started. And since I live not too far from Santa Monica Beach, I was
Right.
able to go down to the beach and see that the volleyball uh,
Mm-hmm.
pitches were basically dug these 10-foot holes, and the skateboard park was filled with sand. It was a very sad thing to see. But the skateboarders dug out the sand and got back to skating as soon
Oh
as they
yeah.
got the sand,
Good
removed.
for
So
them.
yeah, and we know now that those policies did nothing to flatten the curve, so to speak. So but we got to watch it and live through it, and here we are.
All politics. And speaking of, there's this meme that I saw that you just kind of reminded me of. It's the one where there's somebody like underwater and they're reaching for to get help, And
Mm-hmm.
then I think normally the meme gives them like a high five and some gives them some cliche, but
Yeah, then they go on. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
in this case, it's inflation is the water, and then there's a glass of water thrown on it, and it's like whatever it is, the Biden Inflation Relief Act or whatever it was.
Right,
Um,
right.
so what maybe without getting too wonky, you can kind of catch us up on some of the policy and politics from the past year because, like I said, it's interesting, but I've been a little bit out of it for
Oh,
the last
oh.
year or so.
Well, let's just jump directly into controversial territory, shall we?
Yeah.
But then I think it's only
Without further
controversial.
ado.
Right, exactly. But I only think it's controversial because of what I just said. I think
Right.
people's ignorance of how
Right.
how economics works and then how policy impacts economics,
Right.
I think is the driving factor. I'll start with January 20th,
Mm.
2021, and probably the very first
The
executive order that was
inauguration.
signed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the inauguration day of our current administration.
Mm.
The very first thing that was signed was the termination of if I have the name correctly, the XL pipeline.
Uh-huh.
So not only did that immediately end, ultimately hundreds of thousands of jobs because you
Mm.
have, thousands of skilled tradespeople,
Right.
plus their families, plus the services and companies, even if it's down to restaurant and transportation and mechanics,
Right.
those extended industries, hundreds
Right.
of thousands of people were immediately put out of work. Number one,
By the Green Monster.
by the big green monster, the Green New
Yeah.
Deal,
Right.
and you know everyone said, okay, great. Here
Yeah.
comes the more expensive gas because now you have just eliminated a future source of energy. And
Right.
what people don't understand is that energy production is all future based. And it's
Yep.
all about the anticipated volume of the energy, natural gas, oil, et cetera,
And how much we can
uh,
predict it.
and how accurately we can predict it.
Yeah.
Therefore, has an impact. I will say. I will
Right.
not
Right.
say it
Right.
drives it, but it has an impact
Right.
on the current fuel prices. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's step one. So if you don't understand that particular piece of economics and how
Mm-hmm.
the oil industry actually works, you'll miss the connection. So if you then deliberately limit
Mm-hmm.
the actual future supply,
Right.
you've now created scarcity in real time, meaning you even though the impact will not be felt until the future,
Right.
it takes years to spin up oil production.
Right.
Once you shut it down, it can take it. I mean, there's a refinery here in Torrance that several years
Mm-hmm.
ago, due to a less than savvy operator, resulted in a pressure buildup that ultimately caused a massive explosion and destroyed the refinery.
Wow.
Um, Later on, I think it's Exxon's refinery, and they said it's
Mm-hmm.
going to cost $2 billion to repair this
Wow.
thing. That's not an insignificant amount of money. I mean, years ago that was a lot of money. Now we're handing out billions of
Yeah.
dollars.
You want a billion, you get a
Every
billion. You get a billion.
you
You
get
get
a
a
billion,
billion.
everybody gets a
Yeah.
billion, and oh, you get 11 billion.
Yeah. Yeah. You get a trillion.
So it's kind
Whatever.
of so to put it in scale, it's kind of been lost,
Mm.
with the progression of time. But long story short,
Mm.
it's going to take 4 or 5 years
Mm-hmm.
to repair it. In addition to the $2 billion to repair it, and of course, with
Right.
inflation, it probably costs even more now. So
Right.
to impact, supply in the future is a very big deal. Now, the administration said many times, I can't wave a magic wand and impact the price of oil. Well, everybody that knows better knew immediately that that's exactly what a president has the ability to do, and that's exactly what he did when it came to signing this
Mm.
executive order that dramatically impacted the supply of oil. But from my observation, another thing that people don't really recognize is that as much as the oil industry is criticized by certain government officials,
Mm-hmm.
every single thing that the oil industry does is at the behest, permission, or shall we say, at the pleasure of the federal government.
Right.
Um, their ability to drill on federal lands is,
Right.
lo
Right.
and
Right.
behold, the federal government. The licenses that must be granted to the oil companies in order
Import,
for them to
export.
drill on these federal lands are granted or withheld by the
Right.
government. And we've heard that there's been a tremendous volume of those licenses being withheld.
Yeah. And
The
tariffs for
nature
import, export tariffs.
Say that again. Hmm?
And the tariffs that they set on import and export
For who? For the American producers or for the foreign producers?
for the foreign producers. That's set by the federal government.
Got it. There we go.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, so basically every step of the way, the federal government has absolute say over the oil industry and what
yep,
happens.
yep.
So, and I think that because it's so profitable for the oil companies, they play along. They're not
Hmm.
really going to stand up and protest and say, oh, don't do this or don't do that. Because let me correct myself. What I'm saying is when
Yeah.
they get when the oil companies are badmouthed by the government,
Hmm.
they are in a position where they kind of just have to sit there and take it
Right, right, right. Because
because
they're in bed together.
they're literally in bed together. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
basically the case I was
Literally.
building.
Yeah.
But in this case, or I'm sorry, but it's not a but in this case, it's a and in this case,
Yeah, yeah.
when the oil executives were brought to the White House to discuss production,
Hmm.
two things very interestingly were revealed.
Hmm.
What was revealed was the current Secretary of Energy, really revealed that she has no clue as to how the oil industry actually operates. In other words, the request of the
So she doesn't know
administration
how to
was
do her job, basically.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
The request to oil companies and the industry itself was,
Mm.
go back to producing oil.
Right.
And the oil companies reported after the fact that they were kind of literally scratching their heads, like saying, "Look, we explained that that's literally not how this works.
Yeah.
We can't just flip a switch and it comes back on. We are 2 years away
Yeah.
from getting back to even close to what we were producing, a year or 2 years ago, because of the nature of what requires the shutdown and what is required to regenerate the volume of oil that we were
No, they
both,
can't do fracking.
exactly. Well,
Yeah.
fracking is one factor,
Right.
but there's the oil research and discovery to find it in the first place,
Right.
the exploration component.
Hmm.
Then there's the actual getting to once they find it, there's getting to it, the drilling component.
Hmm.
There's the transportation component, getting it from wherever they found it back
Right.
to
Right. Right.
places where it's able to be refined. And the XO pipeline plays a huge role in that, or was going
Hmm.
to play a huge role in that part of the process. Then there's the refining process, and then there's the getting it from the refinery to the fuel stations and other fabricators in terms of how
Hmm.
the many ways that oil is used, which is basically, what people don't understand additionally to that is that every facet of our economy is completely dependent on oil. Um, if,
Hmm.
if you pick up anything on your desk, oil was used to produce it. I mean, that little
Yep.
the mic thing that's hold
Yeah.
the shock mount for your microphone,
Yep.
I'm guessing is plastic. Well, that's oil.
Hmm.
The If there's any polyester in your shirt, it's
Yep.
made from oil.
Right. Right. Right.
um, the bottles, everything, literally everything we interact with on a daily basis, unless it's literally made of wood,
Yeah.
is made of oil. And then it took oil to get that piece of wood, to
Yeah.
my house.
Right.
So, we underestimate how dependent we are on oil. And I think
Right.
that has led to also this wonderful misnomer called the electric car. Um,
Yeah. No,
you know,
that's all you can get in 2035 in California.
in California, but something very interesting. So first off, electric cars are literally coal-powered cars. Why?
Right.
How is that? Well,
Yeah.
80. Correct me if I'm wrong. You may have a more accurate take on this number than I have, but I believe it's
Maybe,
something like
maybe not.
80 to 86% of all of the energy that's produced in the United States is produced via coal-powered plants. So we
Yeah,
feed it
something like
coal; it
that.
gives us electricity. So if that's the case,
Hmm.
so it's nearly 100% of all the energy that's then used to charge
Yeah,
your
or at least
electric car,
80%.
at least 80%, let's say,
Yeah.
is so basically your car is a coal burning vehicle.
Also,
Now,
even if they're using wind turbines, those are government subsidized and often subsidized by other oil things, which there's some value in that to innovate. Maybe one day we'll figure out how to do
mhm,
turbines with different kinds of motors, etc.
that don't
But
use oil, yeah, sure.
yeah, maybe one day. Who knows? Who knows? But for now, you're right. We're overly heavily dependent. And I'll just say too, this is actually really good because speaking of memes, like a minute ago, I I would see people post a lot of memes the last year where
Hmm.
they would, complain about gas prices and blame Biden. And again, because I wasn't paying attention very well, I would be
Hmm.
like, How did Biden do that? Isn't it just supply and demand? And these random friends
Yes.
on Facebook didn't have a very good answer, but I should have asked you. So now you're bringing us up to speed on all these green monsters and oil monsters and turbine monsters and all these psychological forces. So carry on.
We
Well,
haven't
they
even gotten to
are.
the psychological
Okay, okay,
part
we'll
of
get
this
to
this
that
whole
in a
game.
little bit,
But
but go
I
ahead.
think it's important that people do understand, for I guess for those who haven't looked that deeply into it,
Hmm.
that there is a pretty much a one-to-one relationship
Hmm.
between limiting the oil supply
Right.
and the price of literally everything going up. Because as I said, we are, for better or for worse. I mean, I see that there's pros and cons to it, but for better or
Right.
for worse, there are some tremendous pros to being oil based that we often
Yeah.
overlook when we're worried about polluting the environment.
Right.
Now,
Right. Right.
for example, the volume of air pollution in
Mm.
general types of pollution in the United States has been on a consistent decline since the early 1970s. There was
Hmm.
a very
Right.
big push, Earth Day, et cetera, set off
Yeah.
a chain reaction among producers, among a variety of industries, and certainly
Right.
with government, to have cars be less polluting,
Right.
to have electronic devices be less demanding of oil and
And
not of
more
oil, but of
smog
energy.
tax.
Well, yeah, well that came in like the early 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But we have a situation where devices actually, electronically speaking, wasted a tremendous amount of energy
Yeah.
because if you notice from the old transformers, it would come in as 120
Mm.
volts. It would then
Right.
be
Right. Right.
reduced down to the 12 or 13 volts that the device
Right.
actually uses. So even as a child, I looked at that and I said, that's awfully wasteful. Can't we either siphon off that
Yeah.
energy or find other devices? And I think, for example, USB type devices were kind
Uh-huh.
of that solution, even though they to some degree have to
Hmm.
reduce that energy load as well. But the
Hmm.
devices themselves ultimately ended up demanding less power to be used through improvements going
Hmm.
from tubes, vacuum tubes, to
Right.
electronic circuits. Was a major step in saving energy.
Right.
And innovations like that, even though they still need to continue in terms of how we use the voltage
Yeah. Yeah.
and energy, still need to continue. But
Yeah.
that said, all of that was ignored when it came time to, let's go back to the Bill Clinton Al Gore days,
Yeah.
the Kyoto Accords. And I
Right.
think I think the Kyoto Accords are very powerful, turning point in people's awareness of what we need to do from a policy perspective and what's possible from a policy perspective, because basically the Kyoto Accord called for a 50% reduction of energy consumption, and I'm sorry, a 50% reduction in emissions by a specific time. And at the time, and I know I'm one of the few people who actually read the Kyoto Accords, but to memory, I believe it was from the time the Kyoto Accords were ratified. I
Mm.
think there was a 10-year window when
Mm.
every country in the world had to reduce its emissions by 50%.
Mm.
Now, if you're a small, mostly rural, or even an agricultural country, to
Mm.
some degree, if you're that's not necessarily going to be that big a deal to reduce
It
your
probably
emissions.
happened anyway.
That was going to happen anyway, number
Yeah.
one,
Yeah.
right? So good point. But if you then introduce those types of policies into a heavily industrialized country, like say India, China, the United States,
Right.
that becomes a very different thing
Right.
because what I saw, was it would literally cripple the
Mm.
entirety of the United States economy to
Mm.
reduce
Mm.
our emissions by 50%. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
That means trucks disappear. That
Right.
means most cars, will become illegal to be able to be used. That means manufacturing is going to have to come to an end by and large.
Yeah.
All of which was doing a
Yeah.
very solid and steady job of reducing emissions through that point, and has continued to do so.
And maybe
One
they
of the
could have just made the power grid more efficiently, like you were saying. But
why
well,
would
the
we do
problem,
that? That would work.
yeah, well, the problem with that is it would you don't know how long that would take,
Yeah,
and
we do. We literally do. We know
okay,
it would take years, if not a decade or more, to do that.
right, right, right,
The state of California itself declined to expand its power grid infrastructure.
right,
I think in the late
But by
70s or
then
early
it's a new
80s.
administration, so the
Right,
current
exactly.
administration wouldn't get credit for it.
Right. Well, there's that dynamic.
Yeah, it's
But
politics.
they had the chance to expand their power grid. They noticed that there was an upswing in, as there always historically until now has been in California,
Mm,
population was just growing. I don't want to use the term organically. What would you call when people are just still migrating for opportunity to California?
yeah.
But the energy needs of the state were continuing to climb.
Mm,
But the state, in its infinite wisdom, said, "Nah, we're not going to build more
yeah.
infrastructure. We're not going to build a wider power grid," and they let it alone.
And they shut down
So,
their nuclear plant
and they
in
shut down the
by
nuclear
San
plants.
Diego.
Yeah, I see it sitting there every
Yeah.
time I head down there.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
pretty tragic.
Yeah.
But here we are, and along comes Enron,
Mm,
and then they are vehemently vilified for their planned rolling blackouts
wow.
as their
Yeah.
contribution to the crisis. But the reality is, the state has was already doing rolling blackouts, and they
Yeah.
continue to do rolling blackouts. And the cities in LA County
Yeah.
have a schedule that's published as to when
Ugh.
and what parts of the cities will be experiencing blackouts. Of course, those blackouts are not happening in Bel Air and Brentwood,
Yeah.
in Malibu. So
Maybe
you can
Inglewood
imagine.
back then.
Right, exactly. So South Central Los Angeles, South
Right.
Los Angeles, Watts, etc. Those are the places where those rolling blackouts, and actually parts of Mid City, Los
Yeah.
Angeles as well.
Places where they literally still have gravel roads to this day. Like
Yeah, in the
that's how
back
screwed up it
alleys.
is. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and sometimes in the streets you'd expect because I was driving Uber there a couple years ago, and on
Mm-hmm.
some of the normal streets that you would expect to be nicely paved,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe not technically gravel, but they just haven't been maintained in probably a decade.
Right.
So
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
effectively gravel roads
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because no, the only area people cares about is where they're getting the bribes downtown
Mm-hmm.
and areas like that. But
Yeah.
that's another subject, perhaps.
And for better or for worse,
Yeah,
that dynamic is at least threatening to change. There's a
yeah,
lot of projects, going on. LA for some
yeah, yeah,
reason, and I say for some reason, has become both a utopia for entrepreneurship,
yeah, and
because I think
corruption
this the
at the same
city.
time.
Well, I'll get to that part.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not
okay,
ignoring, that part.
right, right.
But there's tremendous movement
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah,
enlist smaller entrepreneurs
right, right,
in
right.
helping to grow the Los Angeles economy, because the city itself understands that it's the small entrepreneurs, and not only small entrepreneurs, but they're broken down to the minority entrepreneurs. That includes different races that are typically not, represented in the larger
Mm,
contracts. But also, huge chunks for women entrepreneurs, Black
right.
entrepreneurs, Latino
And they're a
entrepreneurs,
lot
et
less
cetera.
corrupt that way. It's the big companies that have the corruption primarily.
Um, I think that my actual opinion
Yeah, yeah.
is that the nature of that corruption is
Mm.
literally endemic into the system. And
Yeah,
to
that
your
makes sense. Yeah.
right, and to your point, because the reality is some organizations are actually
Mm.
more qualified than others to fulfill
Mm-hmm.
on certain contracts.
Right.
But here's where the corruption kind of results in it being endemic.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
reason those organizations are more qualified than others is
Mm-hmm.
because of all the contracts they've had leading up to that particular point in
Right, right,
time
right.
that
Okay.
has enabled them to go through the learning curves and the processes and the best
Right.
practice of getting those skills that they can then carry into the next sets of contracts.
Yeah.
And therefore, other companies that aren't as skilled don't necessarily get a chance because they're literally not as skilled or qualified as these
Yeah.
other vendors. So it's not necessarily a corruption by a desire to do evil.
Right.
It's kind of a corruption that I would argue
It's
is sort of
systemic.
endemic. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right,
So
right, right.
so that's so it's interesting because I was working on some projects that were closer than I've ever really gotten to how those projects work, and I was very surprised by the nature of what we might consider to be corruption
Right.
versus things that are endemic in the system.
Right,
That
right,
this new entrepreneurial move has really, I think, to your point, gone a long way to try to correct. And what that means is
mm-hmm.
consciously opening up opportunities for smaller companies,
Right.
consciously saying, okay, here's this massive multi-billion-dollar project, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that contract is comprised of hundreds and in some cases thousands
of small
of
businesses.
smaller pieces
Yeah,
that
yeah.
could be handled by smaller companies.
Mm-hmm.
So to that end,
Right.
you're bringing up a very large volume of entrepreneurs
I
that,
like your optimistic take.
well, I mean, I got to
it's
observe this because
it's true. Yeah, yeah.
I met with companies that would have never,
Mm-hmm.
been able to do it. And one of the big hurdles to this
Mm-hmm.
was the fact that the city itself in these contracts
Right.
really didn't have the ability. They didn't have the teams to conduct the outreach necessary to
Mm-hmm.
pull in the more minority contract. Now, historically, we can
Right.
easily say that it was deliberate, that it was racist, that it was,
Yeah.
that it was buddy slap,
Yeah.
the backroom deal.
White
So
power. Yeah.
all of that, right?
The
So we know that
patriarchy.
that was exactly. So we knew that that part of it was true historically, but
Mm-hmm. Right.
in my observation, the attempt to sort of slow, if not reverse those things,
Right.
have been pretty sensible in the sense that yes, if I am a small entrepreneur,
Right.
I can qualify for say $100,000 contract
Right.
as a solopreneur, for example.
Right. Right. Right.
I can
Sole prop.
qualify if I'm a small 4 or 5 person company. I can
Mm-hmm.
qualify for a $500,000 project based on what I can actually handle.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
opportunities like that have opened up, and I think that that's been a very positive thing for the city.
Yeah.
Um, and I so I think ongoing, I honestly have no problem.
Right.
And your audience, if they've seen me before, they know how
Yeah.
cynical I am about most things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And this is one of the few things that I actually am rather optimistic
And of
about
course, a
after.
city like Los Angeles is kind of like a microcosm for the world.
Correct,
So
exactly.
as
Yep.
we see
And the world
changes,
being the United States,
yeah, well, yeah, the Los Angeles, for example, is a microcosm of the United States. United States is a microcosm of other things like the Western Hemisphere in the West, which is a microcosm of the world, and it kind of
right,
works that
yeah.
way. So, um, yeah, it's nice to find ways to be optimistic. I just kind of got that way sometimes because, over the last 19 years or so, I was bouncing back and forth between Orange County and LA,
Mm.
mostly. And I would always have that mystery between myself and people I talk to, like, why does OC have such nice roads
Hmm,
and
hmm.
and and they're and they can't even like put some paint on the street in LA?
Yeah.
And it's partly because of corruption, but you're right. It's systemic, and you're also right that uh there's some change, but also to this point and some of the points that we've been talking about offline or off recording is I think what's happening there, and maybe this is kind of what you're getting at, is that reason to be optimistic is because um, it's what was happening in spite of the government mandate. The government mandates caused more problems, but natural markets solve what the government screws up. But I don't know. Maybe you
Right.
can
That
chime in on that
uh
idea.
well, I mean, if you're jumping to the COVID related mandates,
Yeah.
I think to a large degree you're correct. And the
Mm.
government did a tremendous
Especially in
amount,
LA.
and especially in LA. And they did
Yeah.
I would say that they even did an extra volume of effort to thwart people from doing those things.
Right.
And sadly, I would argue that it was a very intense struggle for
Yeah.
people to survive during that time
Oh
because
yeah.
the restrictions were so severe
Right. Right.
that we
Right.
were ordered for a time to simply not leave our houses,
Right.
and
Yeah.
we
I
still needed
remember.
to shop, we still needed to eat, we still need to find food, and this is pre inflation.
Right. 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 That was some deflation for that period of time.
Absolutely, there,
Yeah.
there really was, and that was kind of a good thing. But what we're going to
Kind
do,
of.
and
Yeah.
government, of course, was handing out money hand over fist
Yeah.
during the time between the combination of the unemployment and
I
the
wonder if
PPP
that could
loans.
affect inflation. Free money.
Free money.
Hmm.
Exactly, and that's exactly what people said, and that's exactly what we ended up seeing. That I
Yeah.
think they estimated that for that $1,200 check that they handed us on day one, the following year we ultimately paid $3,200, if not closer to
Yep.
$4,000 for that $1,200 check in terms of inflation and other
Yep.
municipal costs. So well,
It's a
other
tax on the
and
poor.
municipal costs,
Well, that's what
quite
inflation
literally.
always is. Inflation is always a tax on the poor
Yeah.
because if you have millions of dollars, it hurts you, but not in a very meaningful way. But on the
Yeah, there we
poor,
go.
it
Yeah,
really hurts them. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it
So
hurt the most those who it helped the most, which
yeah,
is unfortunate. Yeah.
and uh, it's one of those things that if we ignore what's actually going on in
Mm,
favor of what we're told is going on,
mm,
we will always lose.
right, right.
And we were told, for example, that abolishing the police would be a good thing. And
uh,
be, and then specifically in Los Angeles, because I can do a sweep of
right,
the whole country and
right, right.
identify certain other aspects, but LA, was here. And what I
Yeah,
found
you
ironic
really
about
need
Los
good police
Angeles,
in LA.
you really need, and a lot of them.
Right.
But I think what was very interesting was that Measure R or Measure M, I think it was Measure R,
Mm,
which was one of the only political campaigns that I actually canvassed for because I actually believed in it. That the monies were to be allocated to help with mental illness,
mm,
as well as drug rehabilitation,
mm.
instead of going to building more jails. And
Huh.
I found that that was one of the few
Yeah.
genuinely bipartisan moves that I'd seen
Yeah,
politically in
that's
a very long
awesome.
time. And I actually personally got behind it. I said,
Yeah,
this is
yeah, I
absolutely
could get
great.
behind that.
But what I found interesting was that when the riots occurred,
Mm,
um, and the George Floyd situation
right.
happened, I mean, there'd been other riots, but then the George Floyd situation on top of it really sparked it.
Yeah, 2 years ago now.
What the biggest demand was to spend that money and reallocate that money toward mental health and
Mm,
rehabilitation, and to take that money and to take that money away from the police. Now,
right.
Measure R was to take that money out of the coffers for building prisons, not necessarily defund the
Right,
police. But
right,
the principle there was the same in terms of reallocation of funds that were about incarceration and
right,
move them over to places where they could be ultimately more beneficial to
right.
actual individuals. Well, because people don't pay attention, nobody noticed that Measure R was designed and had been successfully voted on. In fact, it won the referendum,
Mm,
and we still rioted here in Los Angeles. So
yeah,
that was a bizarre mystery to me,
right.
he says in joking quotes,
Yeah,
as to why
yeah.
people were still rioting in Los Angeles when the city of Los Angeles and its
Mm,
residents democratically voted
mm,
to now have those reforms put in place through the normal standard ballot box
yeah.
measures to actually have that happen. And people still opted to burn buildings and kill people.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's probably another one of those things where to do the right thing, you wouldn't see the effect of it until after Eric Garcetti and the next administration. So you got to do window dressing stuff for now, which
Well,
is unfortunate.
generally speaking, I would say that's generally correct, but I think there was one
Mm,
exception to that in this
mm,
case,
okay.
and that was the arrival of the district attorney Jorge Gascon,
Yeah.
George Gascon.
Yeah.
Um, he came in after basically turning San Francisco upside down, and
Mm,
he came in to be a reformer.
okay.
And it was the biggest bait and switch I've ever personally experienced.
Wow.
For example, he said, "Okay, we need to reform these things."
Right.
And I listened to him. I listened to his debates. He sounded, reasonable. He sounded like he was knowing what he was doing. He was a DA in San Francisco. I took that. I stupidly didn't do any research on what had happened in San
Yeah.
Francisco under his tenure, but
That
I just
takes, yeah.
basically did exactly what I had said don't do,
Right.
because I listened to what was being said. I listened to what he said. I ultimately voted for George Gascon.
Yeah.
And as soon as he ultimately got into office, the first thing I heard was that he's going to suspend special circumstances.
Mm,
And special circumstances are if you do a crime
right.
and it is especially brutal or heinous or a number of other criteria,
Mm,
you will get additional prison time,
wow.
and whatever other more severe punishments they
Mm,
can mete out upon you. And he eliminated that. So what
wow.
that meant was there was the very first case that came to light was a gang member who was in prison with special circumstances who had not only murdered this teenage boy,
Wow.
but they had, I believe, burned his body and threw him off of a cliff.
Hmm.
So multiple tragedies on top of multiple tragedies, and because the special circumstances no longer applied, he had
Mm,
served his basic prison sentence,
right.
and since the special circumstances no longer applied, he was immediately freed.
Wow.
And this absolutely drove the family, apoplectic, because this
Yeah.
person who not only murdered but brutally and just sadistically
Wow.
murdered their child was out on, was running the streets for, running the streets free.
Wow. Wow.
There's been many cases where I refer to Boston for one example, but it's also happened here. But I can cite specifically the case in Boston where they
Right.
are under a similar prosecutorial regime,
Mm,
and they're releasing convicted killers. In one case, the killer was released early,
mm.
and the very same weekend found his ex girlfriend and murdered her. Boom, end of
Wow.
story.
Wow.
Now, a high school friend of mine was actually at the time the police commissioner in the city of Boston, and he came out and was livid about what the city was doing under the leadership of the mayor, of the then mayor. And he's like, these policies are absolutely insane. I have to go and actually see the actual and net result of these policies. I have to go see the people who are brutalized as a result of these policies, and this is insanity gone completely mad. Now, here in Los Angeles, and San Francisco for that matter, you saw most recently the case of, what was it, like 60 people, sort of what I call gang robbed
Mm,
this 7-Eleven. uh, all of those people know that they're not going to be prosecuted if they're even arrested for doing that, because it's basically no longer a crime here to do those things. So we've seen in New York, we've seen in San Francisco, we've seen in Portland, we've seen here in Los Angeles that the murder rates have gone up, multiple hundreds of percent. I know in New York City, the murder rate had gone up 400%.
wow.
The random crime rate had gone up percentage points in the thousands. So when there's no actual punishment for crimes, not only do those crimes increase, the less violent or the less dangerous tangential
Mm,
crimes also increase, because they're farther away
right.
and they're less likely to be prosecuted. So basically, you have a lawless geography. And ultimately,
Mm,
what ends up happening is that, people start leaving, in massive numbers,
mm,
and the governments basically come out and say that there's no problem,
yeah.
and that's where we are. So
Well,
it's up to you to do the research. Now, um, the research dynamic then gets us to George Floyd and the research
mm,
that I did when that happened. My recent visit to Minneapolis,
yeah.
as far as what's happened since, and what my research found since then, because I learned my lesson with Gascon. I mean,
Mm,
I do my best to do my research anyway,
right.
but I thought I was doing my research when I listened to what he was actually saying and the policies that he actually was advocating for.
Yeah.
But obviously, I, like thousands of others, were misled. I mean, the biggest thing that people say about Gascon is that it was the most
The
successful
DA.
political bait and switch that
Right.
they've ever seen.
Yeah. Politics. Imagine that. So on this very unfortunate issue of an unarmed in particular black person being killed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how familiar you are with, I think it's Donovan Lewis that was just a couple days ago in Cincinnati.
Mm.
Yeah, I guess not, but yeah, there was just another one, and what I'm hoping is um, we've learned that if a person is shot unjustly, there should be justice regardless of who the color was of the person shooting and getting shot. And
Well,
that's
for
equality right there.
the
It's not
viewers at
popular
home,
equality, but it's equality.
no, I get it. For the viewers at home, can you give any background on that Cincinnati story?
Sure.
Because you're right,
So
I haven't heard anything
yeah,
about it.
so it happened only like 2 or 3 days ago.
Okay.
We're recording September 1st, for those who might be listening a little bit later here in 2022. And yeah, I was just the body cam videos just came out, I think yesterday. And so I was looking at some of them last night, very sadly. So basically what happens in these body cam videos, you can, for those who might be interested, You can uh, search Donovan Lewis. He was a 20-year-old that was sort of inadvertently shot and killed by a white police officer, and he's black or some mix of black. And I guess the if there's good news out of it, it's that there's no rioting yet. Although I hope that will still be the case, maybe in however many months when um, whatever happens with the sentencing of that police officer
Hmm.
who made that shot. Um, so
And the
hopefully
cir
we've learned.
uh
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask the circumstance of the
So yeah.
why
So
the
so
police were there in the first place.
yeah. So basically, from what I understand, and is there was some charge that was made as far as drugs in a particular apartment. You know, the quote unquote war on drugs.
Hmm.
And so they went into this apartment, and this is just all kind of what you see if you look up this body cam video that's on YouTube with some censorship, thankfully. And so they go into this apartment. They get out a bunch of people that are kind of harmlessly harming themselves with drugs,
Harmless
and
to homie. Okay.
yeah. So they're in the privacy of their apartment, probably getting high on something that may or may not be illegal. That's kind of beside the point for this. And
Hmm.
so they're cuffing everybody, but one guy happened to be like in the back bedroom, and he was probably sleeping maybe from too many drugs or whatever, but he was probably okay other than uh very much asleep
Mm.
or in an unconscious state of some sort. And so
Okay.
they cleared everybody out of the apartment, probably at least 5 or 6 people, with police and a police dog. And then they know there's somebody in the back room because the dog is telling them this, and then what happens is, and this might be a benefit for some people who don't want to watch the video, because you see someone shot and killed if you do watch the whole video,
Mm.
um, which I halfway regret seeing, but you know, anyway.
Yeah, I
So
stopped watching videos like that decades ago.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I actually my dad was watching it, and I anyway. So, but since I saw it, I will finish describing what happened. It wasn't that bloody, but basically the body
Bloody
cam video.
enough, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
So did he attack the police officer, or you said he was asleep?
He was asleep, and they finally got this back door open,
Hmm.
and they said, "We're police, open the door." They finally got it open, and the 2 points that will, I'm sure, be argued a lot is there's one mysterious sound, like a few seconds before that bedroom door is open. This
Hmm.
sounds like maybe it could be a gunshot or something like that, but it could have been
Gunshot.
any number of
Okay.
things.
Hmm.
And then when they open the door, he's just kind of like up on his knees. He's not doing. He's like at least 10 feet away, and he's not doing anything threatening. He's like he just woke up, but he did have a vape pen in his hands, so they could argue they thought it was a gun.
Hmm.
And most of the police officers knew not to shoot, especially in a potentially fatal way. But the
Hmm.
the one who was actually controlling the dog just like peeked his gun and probably wasn't trying to be fatal, but he kind of did so out of instinct, and that ended up killing this young man, which is very unfortunate. And so it puts us kind of back in that uh, George Floyd situation. Maybe, I mean, probably not to the same degree, because of course the whole George Floyd thing was arguable, that there was this big gap of time and maybe he could have been saved, although that's arguable because maybe he was already ODing on whatever drugs George Floyd might have been on, so it's arguable. uh, so the optics were definitely different,
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
sure, which is probably why that there's less of an uproar for this than there was for George Floyd, because the optics were really really bad for George Floyd. You had like
Hmm.
a white police officer that almost looks like a neo-Nazi
Yeah.
on a typical looking African American guy, and whereas this one is Someone who arguably could have been, in fear for their life.
Hmm.
But all this is to say that, like I said, hopefully we are maturing as a culture and a society that, as sad and as unfortunate as those things are, um, two wrongs don't make a right. But it kind of remains to be seen,
Yeah,
what we've
I
learned.
yeah, I think the thought complexity that's required to
Right.
navigate these
Mm-hmm.
circumstances has been completely evaporated out of our culture,
Yeah.
and it has disabled us to think critically about these situations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
to mention that when we are informed about these circumstances, we are first and foremost typically underinformed about what has actually happened,
Right.
and then we are also deliberately misled, as to
Right.
what actually happened.
Especially
So
when there's big theatrical situations like there was with George Floyd, for example.
especially.
Yeah.
I would even argue that generally speaking, there's theatrics
Right.
around everything.
Right.
And then
Right.
there's some things that therefore are able to be accelerated, or magnified in their
Right.
theatrics, like the George Floyd situation.
Right.
I think we would have had the same level of violence if there had been body camera footage around Breonna Taylor,
Mm-hmm.
case, because I read many things that directly contradicted the news reports about the Breonna Taylor case.
Right. Right. Right.
And now we're finding out that at least one of the police officers actually fabricated the story that was used to gain the warrant,
Right. Right. Right.
about that. So that story is continuing to evolve. And
Right.
basically, nothing that was originally reported is being proven to be true.
Right.
But I think the Minneapolis case is actually a very interesting one for me personally, because
Yeah.
I got to visit Minneapolis about a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was absolutely stunned at what I actually saw there.
Was there
And
still
what I
some of
sub
the aftermath?
not so much the aftermath, but I would argue the environment that ultimately led to it,
Like the political
because
environment
the
and
political
cultural
environment, the
environment.
social environment,
Yeah.
exactly, and ultimately the policing
Mm.
was eye opening. Now, I had already had my doubts around the nature of the George Floyd case, in terms of what had happened, and why it happened, and of course, my views are to that degree irrelevant, but also probably for some people quite controversial.
Yeah.
But I'll break it down step by step. So the very
Sure.
first thing I did when I had read about the George Floyd case was
Mm-hmm.
I went to the Minneapolis Police Department's website
Mm-hmm.
and the Minneapolis City Council website, and I found that the police hold, the knee to neck uh, restraint that Chauvin was using on George Floyd was completely approved by the police department, as well as and therefore the city council.
Yeah.
So he was not outside policy in terms of his behavior. He was immediately, of course, thrown under the bus by the city council and by the police department
Right.
for basically the optics, as you had just described them. But
Right.
as
Right.
far as him acting within policy, he was not in violation of policy
Mm.
on any front that I was able to find. Now,
Right.
as we start to look at the judgments of
Mm-hmm.
how he was able to keep George Floyd there for the 9 minutes, was it the 9 minutes and 37 seconds?
Yeah.
That is really my only and main question as to
Right.
why
Right.
he would have kept George Floyd there for that period of time. And maybe I think that's the area where Chauvin was
Mm-hmm.
ultimately culpable, but he was nonetheless not in violation of the city's policies. So that's the first clue that I had in terms of what was going on there. So
Yeah.
my
It's
question
it's
is
social optics.
completely social optics. And so my question then became, if this restraint is so
Mm-hmm.
dangerous, why was it allowed to be used by the police in Minneapolis?
Mm.
Now, what I learned subsequently is that restraint is actually used around the world. I
Right.
believe it was developed in Israel. It's used all over
Yeah.
Europe. And in fact, in the Paul Greenglass movie about that, the right winger who had went onto the little island and
Mm.
murdered the students. No, yeah, um, when in the movie, when they caught him, when the police
Mm,
finally came to that and caught him, they actually used in the movie a knee to neck restraint when they captured him.
right.
And I've seen dozens of other photographs from around the world of that
Yeah.
technique being used on criminals or suspects that they've apprehended. So
Right.
it's not an unusual maneuver.
Right.
Now,
It's
when
usual.
I got when I got to visit Minneapolis, I did learn something or several things that were very interesting to me.
Right.
One of which was the Minneapolis Police Department, via a lawsuit regarding someone else who had died under exactly the same circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
They had been ordered to stop using that restraint 2 months prior to George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
They opted to not stop using that restraint, and they just continued using it as a matter of policy.
Mm. Yeah.
So the more I dove into Minneapolis as a city, the more I was informed while I was there as the nature of the city, its
Mm-hmm.
politics, and its policing, the
Right.
more I got a very interesting picture of what was actually going on there that was never really reported, that was never ever reported, not never really, but never ever reported in the news.
Yeah, at least not the mainstream media for sure.
I honestly never even heard, I mean, I listen to as much media as I can, no matter
Mm.
what its source.
Right.
And the dynamics that I'm going to mention here were not things that I had seen from any particular news source.
Okay. Wow.
Um, you could find, for example, that the birthplace of woke, if you will, the
Yeah.
birthplace of the social justice movement,
Right.
it can be considered to be Minneapolis.
Oh, really? Okay.
And why that's so is that Minneapolis itself has, going back more than 100 years,
Mm-hmm.
a reputation as a hotbed for progressive thought,
Hmm.
and progressive thought that is ultimately spread out through the rest of the country,
Another
into the.
microcosm.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So you start off with, if you know, the concept of quote unquote radical feminism was coined
Mm.
by a feminist academic in Minneapolis.
Okay. Yeah.
If you look at the Duluth model for domestic violence, it was actually not
Mm.
developed in Duluth, ironically. It was actually developed right there in Minneapolis.
Wow.
When we look at the tenets of the
Mm-hmm.
social justice movement, they originated, or many of them originated, in Minneapolis.
Wow.
So that to me was quite a surprise to understand, why Minneapolis was and continues to be at the center of a lot of these police actions, which also left me scratching my head. Because what I got to see was Minneapolis was probably the most progressive city that I have ever seen.
Hmm. Wow.
But what I found interesting about that, it was also the most segregated city that I have ever
Mm.
seen. And I was born and grew up in the city of Boston, who's
Yeah.
perpetually being having the finger pointed at them for being so racist.
For being assholes that are wicked awesome.
Exactly, that's exactly right. I mean, I as a child
Yeah.
actually saw the buses
Mm.
that all their windows had been smashed out,
Wow.
racing by me, probably doing 50 or 60 miles an hour. It's the fastest I've ever seen a line of school buses move. And I was
Wow.
asking myself, why are all the windows smashed out? Of course, we as a nation discovered, what was going on after that,
Wow.
even if the story that you received wasn't necessarily accurate, but the
Yeah.
broken windows was pretty something you kind of don't forget. And the speed of the
Yeah.
buses is something. So, you know, so to go from that to then be in Minneapolis to discover
Mm-hmm.
that, let's take something as innocuous as a coffee shop.
Mm.
I saw only white faces in every single coffee shop
Hmm.
that I passed, which that's not the case in Los Angeles or any other city I've been to. It's usually a pretty mixed group, a very diverse group of people
Yeah.
that are hanging out in coffee shops. Well, in Minneapolis, I didn't see a single black face. Now, I even saw right there in George Floyd Square,
Mm.
a black-owned coffee shop. They were very proud and happy to say that this is a black-owned coffee shop. I
But
saw
then it's
black
all
staff.
black people there.
Well, actually, quite the opposite to my surprise. It was
Oh.
all black staff. But as far as
Okay.
the customer base is concerned, I didn't see a single black face in there who is
Black
basically
part-time
being a customer.
slaves.
What's that?
Black part-time slaves.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Working on the plantation,
Yeah.
ironically, in the black-owned coffee shop.
Yeah. Mm.
So, so as I began to zoom out, what I began to see
Mm.
was that it is also a hub of people who are openly Marxist. And what I mean
Yeah.
by that specifically is not about them hiding it versus not hiding it. But anytime anybody claims that a movement or anything is Marxist in its root, it is very immediately and very quickly denied,
Mm-hmm.
to the point that I would even equate this dynamic of Marxism and its denial to what was said about Kaiser Soze in The Usual Suspects.
Yeah.
You know, the most successful thing that the devil has done is convincing the world that he doesn't exist.
Right, right,
And I
right.
think that the social justice movement has been very successful in doing exactly that. They have been remarkably successful in convincing the world that Marxism is not a functioning entity
We'll just
in
call it
terms of,
democratic socialism.
let's just call it, yeah, exactly. We'll call it
I'm
democratic
just
socialism.
Lucifer. I'm not the devil.
Well, not that exactly. In the early part of the century, after they failed miserably in Eastern Europe,
Mm,
the folks who advocated for postmodernism out of what we, you know, from the Frankfurt School, and they brought their postmodernism to the United States,
mm.
landed here in sunny Santa Monica and said,
Santa
"Hey,
Monica, yeah.
it's gorgeous here, but how can we mess all this up?
Yeah. How can we break
And
the gorgeous world here?
how can we destroy this universe?" So they set about
Progressive.
realizing, huh?
Let's
Yeah,
call it
exactly.
progressivism instead of,
Progressivism, right?
yeah.
Well, that's what we call it now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I'll compress the story down that
Sure.
they started to um, impact the language. They started
Mm,
to move, academically speaking, into the
right,
language
right, right, right.
departments of many universities. So we have Northwest. I'm sorry, University of Chicago, I believe. I could be
Mm,
off on that one, but definitely UC San Diego. We
mm,
get into NYU and Columbia. We move off to some degree Harvard,
mm.
and any number of significant universities,
Right,
Yale, et
right.
cetera. Whereupon we start to introduce relativism into the language.
Yeah.
We start to introduce other concepts that previously didn't exist into the language, and
Mm,
then from there they begin to spread out throughout all the academic disciplines, and now they're
mm.
finally getting into the hard sciences, for example.
Right. And now
So
it's
long story,
like, and now biology is a crime because we say that I'm biologically a male and females are
correct.
biologically so. So that's a crime to be that scientific with biology.
Right, and that's what I mean by how it's finally actually reaching into the hard sciences, and
Right, right, right.
it's reaching also beyond biology. It's also reaching into engineering and other hard
Yeah,
sciences. So,
physics and everything
um,
else.
exactly. So you know, mathematics itself is
Yeah.
racism,
Two
is
plus
racist,
two
for
is for
example.
you, you racist.
So the reason I mention that is that critical theory was one of the processes of the postmodernists. What they realized
Hmm.
is that if you just simply just perpetually criticize
Hmm.
something, you'll ultimately begin to break it down in the mind of people who would think differently.
Deconstruct is
You,
their word they like
you
for that.
deconstruct and AKA criticize.
Yeah.
So you don't offer any alternative, and you don't offer anything positive to the conversation, but you just criticize it.
Just screw things up.
Exactly. They realized that it was a very effective psychological move
Right. Yep.
to ultimately weaken any institution that you pointed that critical theory at.
Right.
So pointed at the academia,
Right.
pointed at political structures, pointed at the city hall, pointed at
Yep.
social policies,
Yep.
pointed anywhere you want. People will
Deconstruct it,
become you
which just
become
basically means to destroy.
to destroy, indeed.
Yep.
So, taking that one step further, we then have the offshoots of critical theory, right?
Hmm.
So, critical gender theory,
Right. Right. Right.
uh, uh,
Intersectionality.
intersectionality, which is an offshoot of critical theory
Yep.
again,
Yep.
and of course, we can get to critical race theory,
Yep.
which you know,
CRT.
which so all of those things. So basically, all of these things have ultimately Marxist roots,
Yep.
but they love to basically not just, they don't actually deny that it's Marxist in nature. What they do is they
Neither
sort of
confirm nor
obviate,
deny, like they're working
basically.
for the FBI
So
or
so
something.
for example, um, um, when right after the George Floyd scenario happened,
Yep.
the about page on the BLM website
Mm.
contained very specific references to them being
Destroy the
Marxist,
nuclear family.
to destroy, to I think well, what was the word that
Yeah.
they used, to dismantle, I
Dismantle.
believe is the
Yep.
word that they
That
used.
was the word. They like that
I
word now.
literally had some people tell me that they meant that they were expanding the nuclear family. So this is the mentality of people that actually support this. So I said, so the word dismantle to you now means expand on.
Mm.
So this was very informative to me because I mean,
Uh,
and this was a firsthand conversation, a person I was physically present
yeah.
with, who,
This is what Peterson is big on, the criticism of Michel Foucault, is
mhm,
because he does exactly this, which is to use these type of strategies to destroy things through language,
mhm.
and then the sort of like kung fu maneuver is, if you don't like it, then just be like, it's not my fault, it's language's fault. Throw language under
Right.
the bus.
That's
And
exactly right.
again, that's exactly what they're doing.
That's exactly right. I mean, for example, I was listening to an interview with the creator of the phrase critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw,
Oh yeah.
was being interviewed on MSNBC
Okay.
by Joy Reid, and Joy Reid basically asked her, "Is critical race theory Marxist?"
Mm.
She did not answer the question. She literally said, "Well," and she completely shifted.
Yeah, it's like, it depends on what your definition of is.
Well, she didn't even approach the question. She
Yeah,
never
yeah,
even she didn't she just changed the subject, quite frankly, and she went on to discuss why critical race theory is important.
yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
then Joy Reid, quite predictably, never followed up and said, "So is it or is it not Marxist?" They just moved on.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that to me was very telling because at the end of the day, it is in fact Marxist. But all you have to do is deny, in this case, she didn't even approach the answer to the question.
All
And
right.
Joy Reid certainly didn't follow up with it. But basically, they've just convinced most, like when I tell people, I said that the roots of this movement are Marxist. The roots of the feminist movement is in Marxism. The roots
Yeah.
of critical fill in the blank theory is all Marxism. And people say, well, no, it's not. Um,
Yeah,
and
it's the same.
fundamentally,
It's the same exact philosophy that gave us Lenin and Mao. Like, this is what Jordan Peterson would get in trouble for early on. In fact, with his interview with that British lady a few years ago.
oh,
Uh,
Channel 4,
yeah, yeah,
Kathy
yeah. Newman. Yeah, yeah.
Kathy Newman, yeah.
Kathy Newman she's like, how can you say that trans people are the same as Chairman Mao? And he's like, I'm not saying that. I'm saying their philosophy is the same as Mao and Lenin, etc. Although I'm paraphrasing, of course,
Right, right.
and it's exactly true. And this was why I edited a little video and left it a little bit up to interpretation a couple years ago. Uh, with the reading of Mao's writing, and the reading
Mm-hmm.
of Mao's writing is exactly that. It was more focused on, like we talked about, I think when we recorded last time, it was more focused on um, wealth inequality, but
Mm-hmm.
it's ultimately the same exact philosophy of intersectionality and all these other things that we're talking about in CRT and uh, diversity, equity, inclusion, and everything else. It's Mao's philosophy and Lenin's
Mm-hmm.
philosophy and Marx's philosophy.
But
And yeah,
if you avoid the discussion of Mao and Lenin
yeah,
and Pol Pot, if you avoid
mm.
introducing them into the conversation, you will succeed over
It's a Trojan
time.
horse strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You'll over time separate people from the connection to those philosophies with what's going on
yeah,
right now.
yeah.
So in other words, what you'll have them believe is that these philosophies literally came up out of the ground newly. So
Right.
like Kimberly Crenshaw invented this from
Yeah.
nowhere. BLM, wants to dismantle the nuclear family from
Right.
nowhere. Well,
Yeah.
if you don't
I just
know that
thought
one of
of
the core,
this one
right,
day. It came to me when I was eating breakfast. Let's
it was like an
dismantle.
hour ago, right?
Yeah.
um, if you are of the belief that these people that are staring you in the face in
Yeah.
2022 are the originators of these things, you're not going to ask the question, well, where did they get these ideas from? Only to
Right.
discover that Kimberly Crenshaw, to my awareness, is in fact a Marxist. Most of academics are now behaving as Marxist, I'll say, and a growing percentage of them are openly admitting to the fact that they're
Right.
Marxist.
I almost respect that. Like, as much as I disagree with AOC, you can probably pronounce her name better than I can.
Mm-hmm.
Octavia Cortez.
Ocasio
Yes, thank
Cortez.
you. But at least she's honest and says she's a Marxist, and she says she's everything
Does she
else.
say that she's a Marxist? I've heard her say
I
that she's a democratic socialist.
Yeah, see, that's where
I
language
mean,
gets confusing. So I have respect for honesty, although sometimes people are deceptively fake honest, and that might be the case with her. So it's hard to tell.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that they when she first came onto the scene, they heralded her that she actually has a background in economics,
Yeah,
and I
it's
looked into
Marxist
that.
economics
Well, exactly.
or
And when you look at
democratic socialist economics.
that's exactly right, which
Yeah,
does not comport at all to what we would consider to be traditional economics.
it's the green
That
monster and the things we were
she
talking
has
about earlier.
correct. She has gained her knowledge and education, like Robert Reich, for example,
Hmm.
in the model of Marxist economics.
Yep.
And that is a very different lens, and they will admit to it being a different lens, a way of viewing
Yeah. Yeah.
these things. The same way that Kimberly Crenshaw says
Yeah.
that critical race theory is a way of looking at race relations, which is exactly true.
Yeah.
Marxism
It's
and
a
socialism
Marxist
is
way of
indeed
looking
a
at it,
way
but
of
she doesn't
looking
want
at
to,
things.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
exactly right. But
deconstruct
they'll
the language.
correct, and
Yeah.
they will just they'll brush up against the
Yeah.
border of it, but they won't say what that lens actually is. But they'll just say it's a different lens. They won't say that it is a another type of lens. So I think
Yeah.
that's actually rather important. So anyway, that said,
Mm. Yeah.
um, as soon as it became an albatross around
Mm.
BLM's neck,
Right.
that page disappeared.
Oh
And
yeah.
I know that I took a screenshot of that page,
Mm.
but I don't know where that screenshot ended up. And they changed that page to downplay or at least eliminate the dynamic of their Marxist roots, as
Right.
well as their deliberate intention to dismantle the
Uh,
family. So that was actually crucial. So I think let me do this though. Let me
mm.
also say why it's important that we realize about the Marxist nature of a lot of these movements, because I think that it's easy to make the claim, but I want to spend at least a couple of seconds
Sure.
discussing why I believe that that's important, because there's some
Mm.
fundamental premises under Marxism that whether it's democratic socialism,
Right.
whether it's socialism with a small s, socialism with a capital S,
Yeah, there's
socialism with
pragmatic
a capital
reasons that
C,
it's wrong, not just because it's what we disagree with or
correct.
not on our red
So
team, blue team, purple team,
the
whatever.
first thing anybody who is supporting Marxism will say, it's like, well, what do you mean by Marxism? Because we haven't actually tried true Marxism. Well, that's just the
Yeah.
Kaiser Soze defense. Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it doesn't exist. But what I'm really getting at is that there's some fundamental premises that they
Right.
all subscribe to. And when
Right,
you
right, right.
press them, some of them will admit to it sooner than others, but ultimately they will all admit to the following things. And I would encourage your viewers to actually, whenever they are confronted with anybody supporting any form of Marxism, to drill until they get to these answers. So first and foremost, they all despise. Well, first of all, first and foremost, they have a fundamental lack of understanding of what we would consider to be traditional economics. In fact, they absolutely resent and reject traditional economics as we know it.
Right.
So that's step one. Step two is they absolutely despise history, because
Yeah.
history itself tends to be very inconvenient to their narrative. As we start looking at, well, what actually happened versus what they're telling us has happened,
Right.
multiple things do not line up, and as a result, they'd rather ignore them than
Because
embrace them
Kaiser
or
Sose or the devil is in the details.
the devil's in the well, the devil literally is in the details.
Yeah.
The truth is also in the details, and
And
they
they hate the
prefer to
truth
avoid
when
both.
it ruins their
So
narrative.
that's there.
Yeah.
So another dynamic is that they will espouse tolerance,
Yeah, yeah.
but only for people who agree with them, and
Mm.
they espouse a fundamentally totalitarian running of societies. They will. This is one of the things that they'll deny for as long as possible. But ultimately, when you get down to things like everybody has to take the vaccine,
Yeah.
even in violation of people's human rights, even in
Yeah.
violation of
And
existing
bodily
international
autonomy.
law, we begin to see that there is a totalitarian streak within
Yep.
all of their quote unquote various
But
philosophies.
it's their
The other thing,
totalitarianism, not anybody else's.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And the final piece that is uniform is that when you
Yeah.
really do press them, the last thing that they will admit to is that they are completely in favor of genocide. They are completely in
Yeah.
favor of the mass murder, or at least the both the mass incarceration
Hmm.
and the mass murder of their political enemies. Now, both of those dynamics under UN law constitutes genocide. If you move a massive population from
Right.
point A to point D, that also counts as a genocide because you're eliminating that particular demographics,
Right.
literal their genes from that region. You don't necessarily need to kill someone to be conducting genocide. You just have to physically move them. So, the Gulag structure would count as a form of genocide, and typically under
The
that
Trail of
Gulag system.
Tears.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So those are the things that are consistent among anybody that claims any form of Marxism or
Mm.
socialism or communism. Those things are completely a part and parcel to whatever their beliefs are, no matter
Mm.
how much they claim it's not this and it's not that. So there's that for you. They will love to refer to things that have either changed or never existed in the first place.
Mm.
For example, when we talk about democratic socialism, we talk about where they talk about what went on in Western Europe and specifically in Scandinavia
Mm.
from basically the 50s up until the early 1970s. But what they won't
Mm.
tell you is that the Scandinavian countries ultimately, some quickly and some more slowly, realized
Mm.
that those policies were not working.
Right.
These countries had been very successful financially, economically. Most of them are oil-producing countries, and
Right.
they
Right.
were
Right.
and Sweden, for example, Finland, oil-producing countries, very
Right.
oil wealthy
Right.
to the point of like life there is almost like living in Dubai in the sense that the government would actually hand out cash to the citizens based on its oil wealth.
It must be nice for what do they call that? Jiggering stats or whatever to retell the tale and just focus on a
Well,
place like that.
I'm arguing that it's
Yeah.
even more evil or more deceptive than that.
Right.
What they do, they literally chop out the part of the story where the story itself actually ends, and they pretend that the story
Mm.
is continuing. So what they're arguing
Mm.
is that that these countries have chosen to go this democratic socialist route,
Mm.
and they're still doing okay. Well, guess what? If you actually go to these countries, and
Right.
if you actually speak to the people who are from there, and
Right.
if you
Right.
speak to a lot of the former, but the current, well, actually, I would go with the former political leaders because they're kind of
Hans
returning
Rosling, for
to
example. If
who is it?
Hans Rosling,
Uh huh.
I think he's from one of those Scandinavian countries. Um
Mm-hmm.
and he's fun. Originally, you would think of him as a probably a leftist, but when he got into all
Mm-hmm.
this the stats that he was trying to do working for the UN, um, he realized that the devil's in the details, and so
Mm.
even
Right.
though in his DNA he's probably left, when he got in the details that you can find in books like Factfulness and some others that he wrote with his family, um,
Yeah.
you realize exactly what you're saying. Long story short.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the biggest antiseptic to
Mm.
leftism that I have observed is actual education.
Right.
I've spoken to or
Mm.
heard from or heard about so many people that were these adamant leftists until they actually learned what the heck was actually going on, and they could no longer be leftists. You
Right.
know,
Well, on this point of education, which is something I wanted to get into at least for a few minutes here before we maybe wrap up soon. I had you read a paper that was originally for written for one of my classes that I'm taking at a college in Southern California, and essentially what I'm trying to do, it's a Trojan horse of my own, sort of like we talked about a little bit, because some people, like even Jordan Peterson, are like, don't go to the leftist propaganda machine, colleges and universities. And I sort of agree with that, but at the same time,
mm-hmm,
what I'm hoping can come about from my, you know, publishing information and going through life and school and everything else. One thing is so that people won't have to forego a lot of opportunity that's at colleges. And so rather than, oh no, there's a leftist propaganda machine at the universities, which is true, like we talked about, at least by and
mm-hmm,
large, they can say, okay, I'm in this machine, psychological machine that is a university, a bureaucracy, and all these things. And so, how do I um, get out of it with my soul and how do I get out of it also with a pretty good education as much as I can, and also like the state universities that are often more propaganda based or whatever for a shortcut of terms.
Hmm.
They're cheaper, and to get to the good maybe more liberty oriented universities, they're private and expensive, and not everybody can has that opportunity. So that was kind of the point of this paper that I wrote, which was sort of like a soft response to CRT and diversity, equity, inclusion, which again, to kind of like reveal the magician's Trojan horse trick, is to say, here's all these things that you agree with, right? Anybody who would read this, and then if they do, but they're actually, supporting uh, diversity, equity, inclusion, or critical race theory, they've supported it, but at the same time, it's dismantled. There's that word again: dismantled or
Hmm.
destroyed
Yeah.
their ideology. Then, of course, if you do sort of believe maybe what you and I would believe, it would back that up, but also give a better way to talk about those things without hurting anybody's feelings too much, like can often happen. So on that note, uh, partly under the subject of the paper that I'm talking about, that I put out on medium.com and my Facebook group, but also just like you mentioned, education. And I know you're a big proponent of education in general. How is it that someone now can go through education and potentially, get college degrees and all those other things that are, of course, beneficial, but make it out with their integrity, which is, of course, huge, and make it out with their not being indoctrinated? So, what's your thoughts and advice on that?
Well, if this were 20 years ago, I
Mm,
would argue that what you propose would be even possible.
right,
But
right,
now,
right.
20 years
Mm,
later, I was optimistic about some things at the beginning of this conversation. I'm
mm-hmm.
definitely completely pessimistic about the nature of the current nature of our academic environment.
Right.
And the reasons to me are pretty clear.
Mm,
The metaphor, of course, is that the cucumber is
mm.
determined not to become a pickle when thrown into the barrel of vinegar, right? So
Yeah.
good luck
Mm,
with that. I don't know of
right.
any successful cucumbers who have emerged out of the vinegar. So
It's a good analogy.
basically, the challenge is that it doesn't begin in college. Over the past, say, 40 to 50 years, it started in college, and then it
Mm.
expanded out into the high schools,
Yeah, and
and then
even
it
junior high
expanded into
sometimes.
the elementary schools,
Yep.
and then it went down into now you can find this type of indoctrination in kindergarten.
Yeah,
So by the
unicorns.
time a child actually gets to college, the majority of them are completely ensconced in much of this
They're
philosophy.
Marxists that don't know that they are.
That is exactly correct. Now, here's something that my particular area of research
Mm,
basically bears out an important dynamic that we prefer to sort of look away from, and that
mm,
is specifically the dynamic of gender.
mm,
And
mm.
what we know about gender is that women are much more likely to believe in collectivist solutions,
Mm.
whereas men are much more likely to believe in individualistic solutions just by biological default.
Yeah,
Assuming we
estrogen
still
versus
believe that
testosterone,
by
etc.
exactly, right. So that's a very important dynamic to realize, because once you understand that, the relevance of the fact that almost 70% of all college students are currently women in the United States,
Yeah, especially in the humanities.
especially across the board.
Yeah,
That's what I'm getting at.
yeah,
The
yeah.
percentage is actually higher, of course, in the humanities, but
Right,
I'm
right,
taking a
right,
flat average
right, right, right,
across all disciplines, and
right.
it's officially in the mid 60s, but what I'm observing is it's closer to 70% and climbing,
Wow, yeah.
because also men are actually departing from academia and actually going into trade school
Right.
programs. So
Which
I
is
think that
largely
that's
what Jordan Peterson advises, which Again, the reason I bring that up, I agree with Jordan Peterson largely, and it's not to exactly disagree, but it's for some people that's good advice. For some
Mm-hmm.
people, it's maybe not ideal advice, and so that's kind of what
Well,
we're trying to get at here.
I'll throw this at you because this is my very specific concern
Hmm.
about where college is at right now.
Mm-mm.
Is that unless it's the actual hard sciences, mathematics, physics, etc., and now mathematics itself is under attack,
Right.
there is no other discipline that is currently untainted by progressivism. Every single discipline
Yep.
currently is severely impacted by progressivist thought. And
Right. That's
as
a good
such,
observation that it's really made that change over the last 20 years. Because when I started going to
yeah,
college, originally it was 20 years ago, and it wasn't that bad.
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm,
now that
correct,
I'm
exactly,
kind of going back to school here recently, it's you're drowning in progressive philosophy.
correct. And
Even
it's an
simple
it's
things like a writing class, which is
yeah,
what I was discussing. Yeah.
right, exactly. So as far as someone who really wants to avoid it, the
Mm.
sad truth is you have to avoid going to college or university at this point and seek other forms of education. Um, about
Mm.
about 20 years ago, there's a
Right.
friend of mine who is a very successful writer, and he knew of my interest in studying history and studying economics and things.
Right.
And he and I spoke about me going to get my PhD. And
Mm.
he said, "You're better off severing an arm and a leg and
Yeah.
blinding yourself than you will be to go and try to earn a PhD." Because even at
Yeah.
the time, he said, and he had his PhD, and he was clear that the environment was so incredibly toxic as it related to actual education that it would actually be a harmful exercise for me
Right.
to actually go and do that, because if I didn't completely subscribe and comply with every single tenet of every
You
single
wouldn't
thing that every
pass.
professor said, I wouldn't be allowed to pass.
Right.
I would never make it.
Yeah.
And he said this 20 years ago, and it's only, of course, gotten worse. Now he was
Right.
on the inside and he saw how bad it was. So imagine, in comparison to what it was then, what it is now.
Mm.
So unfortunately, especially since there's a deliberate and focused activity toward purging men out of academia as well, because basically all these
Men and masculinity
men and
to
masculinity,
yeah.
which tend to overlap a little bit.
Right, right,
But
right.
yes, everything is about men and masculinity being toxic first and foremost. But when you start
Therefore
getting into
destroying it.
the mechanism of, for example, these false accusations,
Mm.
um, there's situations where someone has literally declined from going on a date with someone and
Yeah.
then was subsequently accused of
Yep.
sexual harassment and assault.
I've heard
And
firsthand stories of what you're talking about. Yep.
there we go.
Yep.
And they didn't even interact with this person, but
Yep.
they
Yep.
were tried and convicted in
Yep.
these literal kangaroo courts on
Tribunals.
campuses, these
Yep.
tribunals, and then kicked out of school and their funding taken away,
Yep.
and not even allowed to describe, what actually their side of the story is. It was like,
Right.
you've been accused, therefore you're out of here. So
Yep.
in my view, it has nothing to do with the case. It has everything to do with purging men out of the potential of moving into positions of power, to
Mm.
leave those positions open to the people that they would rather see in those roles. So I don't think it's an
Wow.
accident. I don't think it's disconnected, and I
Yep.
think it's another reason why men specifically, and women with sense, should avoid going to college, university, because it is such
Yeah.
it's almost cliche to say, but it is such a cesspool of progressivism
Yeah.
that
Would you say then? Because I'm trying to if possible, find some optimism to maybe even wind down on, is that like one can do so, but it's a heroic feat. That might be how I would look at it.
yes,
Is that how you would say it?
yeah, that's fair.
Roughly,
That's
yeah.
exactly what you would have to do. You'd have to
Yep.
keep your head down. You have to keep your mouth shut, because if you don't keep your mouth shut, they'll find a way to get rid of you. So therefore, all of your efforts
Yep.
will be moot. Number
Right.
one. And then number two, that's what a lot of students who don't agree with this progressivism they're doing. They're keeping their mouths shut. They're
Right.
pretending to go along with it. But if you look at the Marxist component of it, you will still be impacted even if you try to resist.
Right.
That's why when you were in prison camp, they had you write down your confession.
Right.
Therefore, they would start by having you write things that you knew were true, and then you
Yep.
kept writing it, and then they kept writing, and you kept writing until you were admitting to things that you knew were not true,
Yep.
but you were so indoctrinated to that process of writing it down, writing it down, writing it down,
Mm.
that through language, just as they're doing in the schools,
Yep.
your mind is then converted to basically supporting
Yeah.
what they're saying. So, or
What's
what they're
that
forcing you to say.
Solzhenitsyn quote? You might know it, but it's basically a great dictatorship can be overthrown by one person who tells the truth. So
Yep.
telling the truth
Yeah.
is the heroic feat that we're hoping to encourage people to do.
That's exactly right. And somebody else had the quote of what is it? In dark times, telling the truth is in fact a an act of
Treason.
bravery and an act of treason.
Yeah.
Treason is a matter of dates, right? So here we
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
Um, so you're exactly right. I mean, I think if anybody really does want to dive into seeing this, I really do think that the most important book, because there's
Mm-hmm.
other books as well, but the most important book that they could possibly read on this subject would be the Gulag Archipelago
Yep.
by Solzhenitsyn, because he describes the very same mechanisms that these individuals and organizations and institutions are using now. So, for example, the demoralization of anybody who
Right.
disagrees with them as a move is something that he very explicitly describes in, I think it's book two,
Yeah.
as he describes about how the prison camps operated and why they would very deliberately and systematically demoralize the people that they were holding captive simply for the purpose of demoralizing them.
Also, Man's Search for Meaning by Frankel. Very similar book.
Yep. That's true. Ayn Rand,
Yep.
basically everything that she's written, specifically Atlas Shrugged,
Atlas
and
Shrugged. Yep.
Anthem is
Yep.
probably another good book
Yeah.
for understanding how a totalitarian system works. I think people should actually educate themselves on the full definition of totalitarianism as well. And I think first and foremost they should educate themselves on what actual fascism actually means,
This
because that
is.
is a term.
I
Mhm,
was gonna say this is good advice because, um, when I saw, I know he said this a number of times, but I saw Jordan Peterson speak live a few months ago, and
mhm,
in one of these little like after Q&A sessions, someone was asking questions along, actually two or three people were asking questions along these lines of like, I am in academia, I'm pursuing a advanced degree, master's or PhD, whatever, and
mhm.
but it's kind of like a bunch of crap. So what should I do? Should I drop out, or should I uh do this heroic effort like we're sort of talking about? And his answer is similar to what we're getting at now, is read the great books, and
Mhm.
if in so doing you are, and this is of course paraphrasing, but if in so doing you are, that you then have the urge to quit. But if you have the urge to go on and ultimately uh, tell the truth and get your advanced
Mhm.
degree, and you can do so, then do so, but it won't be easy. And so
Yeah,
that's kind of the
I think that's
message too.
wise. I think that's wise advice, because in that exploration you discover who you are in this giant game.
Right, right,
Because
right.
some people will realize it's a game that they don't want to play, and other people
Mm-hmm.
will realize that they are the person to soldier through, and that they can
Right,
see some kind of mission, at the other end.
right.
So I think that is important.
Mm-hmm.
I went to undergrad. I got my master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
I went back and I interacted coincidentally with my old undergraduate institution,
Mm-hmm.
and they are astonishingly progressive now. I mean, it's not even
Right.
the same universe. I couldn't exist there at all
Mm-hmm.
now. There was not, when I was there, any discernible political bent
Yeah,
that
that's
I
how
could detail.
going to school 20 years ago, it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like it, if you're left, right, whatever, that's cool. But now
Mm-hmm.
it's like we're all socialists, but we don't know it. In the
Yeah,
academia,
that's largely it. That's
that's
exactly
the
right.
difference
And
over 20 years.
yeah, absolutely. And I was absolutely astonished. It's not the same.
Yeah.
The principles are different, and everything that they do is completely different. I didn't recognize it, to what it is at this point. And you're right. Back then,
Mm,
you were what you were. Nobody cared. You weren't
right.
bashed. You weren't attempted to be kicked out and sent to the gulags, quite
Right.
literally.
People appreciated some diversity of thought, some diversity of opinion.
Well,
20 years
it was an
ago.
assumption. It was an
Man,
assumption
yeah,
of it
yeah,
existing. I mean, we already
right,
had a diversity of thought. It was just something that existed among us.
right.
Now when we talk about diversity, we're not talking about diversity, and we're certainly not talking about diversity of thought.
Well, pseudo
Um,
diversity.
Pseudo diversity,
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's like you can be, we welcome you if you're black,
yeah,
except of course if you're a black conservative.
right, right,
We welcome you if you're a woman, except of course if you are a female conservative. We
right.
welcome you if you are LGBTQ plus, unless of course you're a conservative.
Yeah, Dave
So
Rubin or
then
whatever.
their welcoming of their tolerance, just basically vaporizes, and you're then called a Nazi and a fascist.
Yeah,
But again,
right,
this
right,
is
right.
precisely why I think it's so crucial that people understand that fascism actually existed, that
Yep,
fascism actually quite literally has a rule book,
yep,
where fascism originated under Mussolini's Italy, and the
yep.
philosophies that drove it, the reasons that Hitler ultimately adopted fascism to run Germany,
Right. And it
and
still
mhm.
exists, but it's like a little flickering candle compared to socialism and Marxism.
Well, I mean, among economists who study it and
Mm.
historians, fascism is called communism 2.0,
Yep. Yep.
because it basically takes very similar premises of control, the facets of control of totalitarianism,
Right.
but it sort of doesn't rely on the central ownership of everything, but it
Right.
does rely on the central control of everything.
Mm.
And
More
it says,
language
look,
games.
well, in this case, it's actually a practical
A pragmatic
game
difference.
as
Yeah.
well, in the sense that under an actual communist regime,
Mm.
the state literally owns all businesses. And in the
Mm.
case of China, for example, the state actually owns about, I don't know what the percentage is, but they always own a portion of a business. I think it's at least 50%, maybe a little bit more. So any
Yeah, and the
company that
ones they
exists in
don't,
China.
they pseudo don't.
Right. And yeah, I don't know which one's supposed to be, but under a
Yeah, yeah.
fascist system, the idea is that the state controls what gets produced, the
Mm.
volume at which it gets produced,
Mm.
and whether or not that company itself operates, while the company itself is still held in private hands.
Right.
So let's take that example into the practical reality.
Sure.
We Mark Zuckerberg,
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
one of the sort of founders of Facebook, was just on the Joe Rogan show and admitted that the FBI directed Facebook on what to cover and what to not cover, specifically related to many
Hunter
things, but
Biden.
specifically in this case to Hunter Biden. Now, the
Yeah,
Hunter
his
Biden
laptop.
laptop, etc.
Yeah.
So when you have government
Yeah.
um, guiding a private enterprise, that is the operational definition of fascism. The
Yeah, so
government should not
basically
have.
the universities are Marxist socialist and the government is fascist is what we have by and large. Would you
That's exactly right.
say
And the
roughly? Yeah.
government and the government, by and large, actually controls these
But both are
institutions.
in denial, which is the funny thing.
Well, they don't deny it to themselves, I don't believe, but they deny it
Right.
publicly and externally.
Publicly.
They
Yep.
they they
Yep.
vehemently deny it externally. So again, it's
Right.
the Kaiser Soze trap. They're
Yep.
vehemently denying that this exists, and they're calling the other guy a fascist.
Yeah.
But we know that
The
direct
orange man.
control of right. We know that direct control of from directly from the White House, even under
Mm.
going back to the Obama administration, to what
Mm.
Facebook was doing, what Twitter was doing, what
Yep.
they were suppressing, what they were allowing. That is the very definition of a fascist control. Now,
Yeah,
it's
control of information.
correct. It's quasi informal or very
Yep.
informal, but it
Yep.
still amounts to government censorship, but
Yep.
only executed through the proxy of these private organizations.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
The
it's been
cat's
very,
the
it's
the cat's paw trick. Is that what it's called?
right.
Cat's paw or cat's tail? Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
So
monkey's
you
paw,
have this
maybe.
scenario, which is what, if which is what,
Oh, if I remember correctly, it's basically where it's a phrase that means um using a fake hand to do the same thing that a real hand would do, but then you're like, well, I didn't do it. which is what's going on
Gotcha.
with what you're
Okay.
talking about,
Per-
which is to
Perfect.
say,
Exactly. That's
oh,
exactly right.
Mark Zuckerberg is the Nazi, not us, or whoever is
Right.
in charge of Twitter now, when really
Cool.
it's the cat's paw, monkey's paw trick. But anyway,
Got it. Okay. No, I think that's the perfect analogy because that's what's going on. And of course, people really aren't connecting it because
right, right.
fundamentally, I believe that people don't understand what actual fascism looks like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They've been told that this individual is a fascist, but
Yep,
I've yet to hear them give any rationale as to why they believe that he's a fascist, other than them being told and the people believing it.
yep.
There is no
He's a
policy
scapegoat,
that exactly, exactly.
Zuckerberg in
So,
this
so if
example.
people do have any serious interest in freeing themselves from this regime of language,
Mm,
they would be it would be well worth their investment in their time and energy to actually understand what these things actually are. What is
yep.
fascism?
Read
What is
read these
socialism? What
books
is
that we talked
communism?
about.
Correct. What is
Yeah,
postmodernism? What
yep,
is what was Michel Foucault's influence as it relates
yep,
to critical theory? And why he believed it was such a great thing in
yeah.
terms of but the whole idea was to literally turn the societies insane, and he's
Mm-hmm.
been doing a great job at succeeding in that based on his principles.
Yep,
So the more information that people can actually get their hands on, the real information, and it's available, it's
yep.
just a function of having to look for it. It is absolutely crucial that people do
And
so if
and there
they have any interest in
and
freeing
there are
themselves.
still what I think they're called Foucaultian psychoanalysis uh operating today. I met one. I think he works in Los Angeles, through Clubhouse. And it's funny too because I started talking to him in social media like Clubhouse. And at first, it's another Trojan horse. Like at first, it just
Mm-hmm.
seems like interesting philosophical stuff. Some of it's even close to Jung, maybe even Jordan Peterson, depending on how you present this Trojan horse. And then I'm going
Mm-hmm.
along with it, going along with it, going along with it. And it's like, oh yeah, Foucaultian. I see what's going on here. You're deconstructing everything and then
Yes.
doing some jujitsu moves, and he'll even use those words sometimes. We can just gotta do some language jujitsu here, and then
Mm-hmm.
ta-da! It's uh, Kaiser Soze.
Progressive.
It's
Right.
what we it's what it's the devil, but we don't call him the devil. It's Lucifer now, and look at that beautiful angel of light. And it's sad that people get seduced by these things and they don't realize it. But
Well, let's bring that into an actual practical scenario, right? So let's go
okay,
back to Minneapolis.
okay,
What I discovered, for example, that when George Floyd was killed,
yep,
he was killed with a very progressive city council. Once the
mm,
next set of elections after the riots, after the death of George Floyd,
yep,
those progressive representatives were voted off the city council. Now, let's be
yep,
clear about who these progressive representatives were. These were the people that approved the policing system in the city of Minneapolis. Therefore, these are the
including
people that
these
approved the
is these methods of choking a person with your knee.
exactly
Yep,
that they approved of the methods that were that Derek Chauvin
yep,
used to ultimately or potentially anyway, or at least contributed to, based on what the facts that have come out
yep,
to George Floyd's death.
yep,
Now
yep,
that's significant because what you have is active Marxists,
yep,
active socialists who are basically rendering an
mm,
entire police state mentality against the black people of their own city, while at
yep,
the same time giving us the Kaiser Sose
yep,
definition of, oh, we're so progressive and we're so tolerant and we want equality and
yeah.
we want justice and we want social justice and we want gender equality.
That's the
But at the
language
end of the
jujitsu
day,
there.
correct,
Yeah,
but there is an overt police state being applied to the
mm-hmm.
black people in the city of Minneapolis. And I
Yep,
found that rather fascinating that I got to see that firsthand. And then upon
yep,
my subsequent research about who's actually running the city, I said, are they actually run by these progressives? And the short answer was yes.
yep. Here's a quick little anecdote that I don't think I've ever uh published or whatever. Is at the George Floyd thing was, about a little over 2 years ago, which
Mm-hmm.
was incidentally about the same time as I was getting into some of these things in a public forum and started this
Mm-hmm.
podcast. And I remember I was doing a little bit of production stuff through, hiring people through things like Fiverr and things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
one of them was I hired this guy to do part of the introduction that people have heard on this podcast. It's like bringing complex ideas or whatever. Who's obviously a black guy, but I thought it was really cool because he sounded kind of like Darth Vader, and it was like just a powerful way to introduce it.
Well,
And
Darth Vader was a black guy, so there.
yeah, well, his voice was a black guy, but that's another
That's right.
podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, um, that's interesting. Anyway, so then I'm like, okay, before I and I'm I have a dialogue with this guy that I paid a little bit of money to uh license me his voiceover and everything. And I said, before I publish this, I just want to make sure you understand what I'm doing, because I don't want you to be offended.
Mm-hmm.
And that being said, I want I want you to feel comfortable that this is going to be presented on my podcast, which it's not anything against, of course, black people or whatever else, but I will question some of this ideology. And what's interesting is he didn't seem to have any. Um, and I don't want to get too personal because I have to credit his name on the show notes or whatever. But he didn't
Mm-hmm.
seem to have
Mm-hmm.
any political leanings for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Seemed like an independent thinker, if I had to guess, which is good. And he said, "Yeah, that sounds good. I don't care. It's just work, and
It's
it's
just
all
work. I'll
good."
take the money.
Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting because that zeitgeist or social milieu of that time was, it's one that could have, if I wasn't a little more brave, I guess it could have postponed the starting of this podcast another few months or a year, like I'd been, putting off starting this podcast for at least 6 months or a year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so again, to kind of get at what all this is about, and because some people might be like, why are you talking about this and that? It's that if we're not careful, the ideas, even if we're unaware to it, it can paralyze us and it can freeze us, to kind of use against some Jordan Peterson terms, but it can turn us to stone. It can make us not achieve what we're supposed to achieve. Uh, so yeah, I just want to encourage people to do the heroic thing, even if it's uncomfortable. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but what do you think?
I agree.
Yeah.
And that heroic thing might be walking away. That
Right. Right. Right.
heroic thing might be saying no. That heroic thing might be leaving college.
Yep.
That heroic thing might be fighting to keep your combustion fossil fuel burning car.
Yeah.
We've been ordered that we're going to lose
Yeah.
all our ability to own fossil fuel burning cars by 2036,
35. Yeah.
35,
Yeah.
in a state that doesn't have enough electricity now
Yep.
to run the state. So we're being
Yeah.
ordered to not only turn to electric cars, and then we're actually at the same time being told not to charge our electric cars because there's not enough electricity. So, and that's in real time. That's going on right now. That
Yeah.
people have been told to not charge their electric cars because there's not enough
and
electricity.
and
But
they won't
we're all being
revamp that
ordered to.
the nuclear power either, which would solve a
No,
lot of it.
exactly. I think the re emergence of nuclear power at this point is
Mm.
inevitable. People will realize that there's no way that they can run
Yeah,
anything. So so there's that. But
yeah,
to your point, I think that people need to start doing research
yep,
themselves. I
yeah,
think that if people can look at themselves and realize that they've only gotten their information from a media source as opposed to reaching out and reading books,
yeah,
historical books, as you noted, the classics.
yep,
If they've not stretched themselves and taken seriously the people that are saying, "Hey, this philosophy has a Marxist or a communist root," and somebody else says, "Oh, no, 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 it doesn't." Well, don't take that as the answer. Go back and look for yourself, because
right,
if you literally pick up Solzhenitsyn, it doesn't take very long once you start
right,
reading his well-written text that the same approaches that were used under the Soviet era are exactly the same tactics that are currently being used in the United
right.
States. It is
Today,
no mystery.
and
So
and
once you
in
actually
many
pick up
other
his,
countries, most other
well,
countries,
I'm
at least
certainly
developed
many other countries.
countries.
I'm just, yeah, exactly. I'm just using the U.S. as the easiest example because
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
where that imposition is going to be most adamantly denied, right?
yep, yep, yep,
But it doesn't take long for you to realize that the methods are consistent with what your progressives are telling you right now.
Mm-hmm.
That, oh, you should do it for the state, do it for the good of the state, do it for the good
Yeah.
of the people around you. What would you like us to do? Well, exactly these things that don't make any sense.
Yeah.
Exactly those things that
And
we
just
don't have an
call it the
infrastructure to support.
Inflation Reduction Act or whatever.
Correct,
When really
exactly.
it's like
And watch.
throwing a glass of water in the pool.
Right,
And
because
yeah,
you can cite
it's
now
just
that
theater.
I was reading yesterday that in Europe,
Mm.
people are suddenly facing, like individuals are suddenly facing 9,000 euro electric bills.
Wow.
9,000 euro. Businesses are facing electricity to the tune of 26,000 euro. I'm talking
Yeah,
about a,
that'll put them
I
out of
believe it,
business.
a month to month basis. So,
Yeah.
so if we're talking about inflation, and energy prices were already much more expensive in Europe than here anyway, to the tune of, on average, maybe twice as much.
Yeah.
Um, so if we don't believe that this is where this can go, then we're flying under this grand delusion that
Mm.
oh my goodness, gas prices of $7. In some cases they got there, but now we're seeing that gas prices are slowly climbing down. Why is that? Is that artificial? That's my concern. That the current reduction in
Mm.
fuel prices is actually artificial, and we'll
Which
see
will
what
mean
ultimately
a
happens.
later real inflation
Correct,
if it's
exactly. That
it's
they
if
won't
it's
that won't
artificial
be
now.
so easy to get rid of. So
Yeah.
that's what my concern is. That I know that they can artificially suppress the prices, and I don't
Yeah.
necessarily believe, because nothing has been done to
Right.
my awareness that would impact, or shall I say, positively impact the price of energy at this point. So that's why I'm
Mm.
concerned that it's an artificial one.
Yep.
In other
Yep.
words, is the government actually subsidizing the fuel so that these prices artificially can be brought down at the retail level, at the pump? So that's what I'm
Hmm.
getting at. But to your
Yeah.
point,
Hmm.
people need to go do the research. The research
Yeah.
is out there,
Yep. Yep. Yep.
and I personally have become less kind to people who resist doing actual research, because at the end
Yeah.
of the day, they are actively seeking to harm me. They're harming
Yep.
you. They're harming
Yep.
themselves. But just as you said, they're not really directly aware of it. So get
Yep.
out there, read your Ayn Rand, read your Solzhenitsyn, read your Neil Ferguson, read your Jordan
Yep.
B. Peterson, for that
Yep.
matter.
Yep.
There's any number of books out there that
Yeah.
are going to probably be getting pretty scarce on bookshelves
Right.
of late.
All kinds. I
Head to a
even
progressive library.
when I found that Mao passage, I wasn't expecting to find it here, but I was reading one of what's his name? Joseph Campbell's Mask of God volume. I think it
Mm-hmm.
was Eastern mythology. Um, but that is and he's not he probably wouldn't he would probably call himself in his era, the 70s, 80s, he would call himself, leftist or something like that, whatever the term they might have been using at that
Okay.
time. But the truth
Mm-hmm.
that's in the classical text that he was bringing about uh shines through. And so, yeah, definitely go down those rabbit holes, dear listeners, and you will be enlightened and illuminated. But on that note,
Yeah.
um, any closing thoughts or closing ideas or anything else people should know about or anything else before we wrap up here in a couple minutes?
I would say that they should revive their skepticism.
Yeah.
And I think that they should revive their skepticism about everything.
Mm.
It's easy
Right,
and
right, right.
encouraged to be skeptical about what your political opponents say.
Hmm.
But I encourage people to access the reality of those things
Mm.
outside of this political conversation. In other words, don't look at the Biden administration or the Trump administration in
Right,
and of
right, right.
themselves.
It's another
Look
Trojan
at
horse.
the the Trojan horses on both sides, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Get
And
out there
Kaiser
and
Soze's.
understand what economics actually looks like, what
Right, right,
actually
right.
drives the price of energy. How dependent are we on energy?
Thomas Sowell, Basic
Uh,
Economics, for example.
Perfect. That would
Yeah.
be a wonderful primer on
Yep.
that.
Yep.
But begin to understand history. Understand
Yep.
that the war on farmers currently going on in
Mm.
Belgium, for
Yep. Yep.
example,
Yep.
has been done before. It was
Yep.
exactly what happened in the Ukraine under Stalin era Russia,
Yep.
where it was basically farmers were declared enemies of the state
Right. Yes.
because of not only
Stalin
their
and
autonomy.
John Lennon, or The other Lenin, not
John
John
Lennon,
Lennon.
Vladimir Lenin.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank
They were
you.
declared
Yep.
enemies of the state. So now, in Eastern Europe, I'm sorry, Western Europe,
Mm,
the farmers are now again being accused of being the enemies of the state all across the West. Not only there, but that's where it's showing up first and foremost.
right.
But we're having the same battles right now in Canada.
Yep.
We're already suffering under this policy in Sri Lanka because they banned chemical fertilizers because they were worried
Mm,
about emissions, the emissions being produced. But now the Sri Lankan population has a deficit in food to the tune
mm,
of 30%.
yeah.
A
Wow.
survivable depression of food is something like 5 or 10%
Wow.
lower yield, but
Right,
they're
right,
down
right,
some 27% in terms of their agricultural output. That
right.
means they're now dependent on having their food be imported from other places. But as
Subsidized.
other places adopt this no fertilizer policy,
Mm.
um, there's no
Again, part of the
food.
Green Monster, by the way, the Green New
Absolutely,
Deal. Yeah.
the Green New Deal. And so the Green New Deal is basically distributing poverty and
Yep.
suffering and death.
Yep.
And you voted for it. This is what you're going to get. And here we are. So that's what I'm saying.
Hmm.
Engage your skepticism. Do your
Yeah.
homework. Read the classics. Read the people that
Yep.
went through this the first time and were lucky enough
Mm.
to leave documents behind, like
Yeah.
books, describing to us what happened.
Uh.
Don't believe anybody on their face. Get it out there
Yep.
and do the homework. There's no other way, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. You mentioned Canada. It just makes me think that it's like Canada is like the European provinces of America.
Yeah,
Like,
quite
and
literally, yeah.
and
And
they're
and
they're
you know, yeah.
basically in that they're more uh progressive, more socialist ideology comes from Europe and tries to then migrate to the United States, which is that's what people don't understand. The United States is this, especially because we are states rather than a EU and so many other
Mm-hmm.
things you can point at. It's kind of like the and because we're an advanced nation, you know, there's some that you might see in some non-advanced nations, but we're sort of this battleground for ideas, battleground
Mm-hmm.
for culture, battleground for all these things that we talked about today and in our previous podcast. And
Mm-hmm.
um, so on that note, I'll say make sure everyone, if you'd like, listen to the podcast we've done in the past and stay tuned. I'm sure we'll try to do podcasts more often together. And yeah, any other closing ideas or thoughts before we wrap up?
Thank you for bringing me back.
Yeah,
The
thank you.
conversation's always good.
Yeah,
I've been sharing our previous efforts with people.
yeah,
I noticed just in looking back how much better that podcast was than what I had remembered because I don't
yeah,
really remember anything when we
yeah.
recorded,
In
but
the
I was
moment, yeah,
very impressed with the flow of it. So,
yeah,
thanks for inviting me back. And I wish that your listeners just keep listening, keep reading, keep
yeah,
studying. And engage your skepticism. I think that we're headed to a very dark future if things continue to move forward. The
yeah,
people that are leading us to that future are telling us, "Oh, it's a bright future,"
yeah.
but there's literally no evidence of anything getting brighter under their leadership. We're seeing
Mm.
hardship, we're seeing shortages, we're seeing literally riots in the streets,
Yep,
and I think we should take that more seriously than
yep.
we currently do. So that's my final parting statement.
Uh, I'm trying to I'm trying to be more optimistic. Uh, but still, I guess the optimism, without shamelessly plugging ourselves too much, is stay tuned for optimism next time.
Yes, exactly. That's
Yeah,
exactly right. There are reasons to
hopefully.
be optimistic.
Yeah, there you go. Hopefully, it will get more optimistic next time we record than however many weeks
Indeed,
or
indeed.
yeah,
Well, there are
yeah.
plenty of reasons to be optimistic. So
Okay.
we just didn't cover them, but there
Yeah,
are, in
yeah.
fact, plenty of reasons to be optimistic, and those signs are there,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
things are happening for the better. It's starting small and it's gaining momentum. So there is there
Right.
is there is
You did
reason for
mention the
hope.
ones in Los Angeles and
Mm-hmm.
things like that, and I'm sure those
Yeah.
are happening around the world. And what I always say is to be optimistic is as bad as it gets in even microcosms and even in um, the culture as such, any one individual can make the most out of themselves and make the
Mm-hmm.
most out of potentially their family, and those in their immediate environment. So
Hmm.
even if it's very, very a sad world, uh, people on an individual level, even though some people hate the word individual, on an
Hmm.
individual level, we can have room for hope. It's just challenging, always challenging times. So
Yeah,
yeah,
has
so
always
yeah.
been, will always be.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, McCall. And yeah, stay tuned and we'll do it again time and sometime and stay archetypal and see you around. Thanks a
All right, Dr. Isaac, thanks again.
lot. Appreciate it. Thank you.